going here. Now, nothing about Liz's stature, but she's not as big as the guy up in Sacramento. So when I expressed my ambitions about appearance, she says, Tom, this is a Pleasanton crowd. They're really mellow. There's nothing to worry about. So here I am, not worried at all. Now, all right. So I guess what we're going to talk about is the Oppenheimer movie. But in light of that, what I'm going to do is going to give you kind of a history. I finally decided the best way for you to make a decision on your own about watching the Oppenheimer movie, and you can draw your own conclusions, is I'm going to give you a history of how all of these things proceeded, and you can make your own conclusions. I assure you, everything I'm going to tell you tonight is well backed up. I can back it up, prove to you that everything I've said is true. All right. So with that, let's start. Now, this thing, I don't want to leave a meeting, that's for sure. Okay, so to start, let's see. The nuclear physics, the world of nuclear physics starts with a New Zealander, Ernest Rutherford. He starts, and they reward him. They give him a Cavendish laboratory in England, and they're making these discoveries. And one of the things that are discovered at the laboratory is the neutron. Neutron is discovered in 1935. A guy named Chadwick gets the Nobel Prize for that. And Rutherford suggests that this particle must be part of the nucleus of an atom. And so you have two particles. You have the protons, which have a positive charge, and that determines what the element is. So if you have one proton, it's hydrogen, two, it's helium, three, lithium, blah, blah, blah. But you can also have neutrons inside these nuclei, and they don't affect the charge. So chemically, they're the same element. And this was discovered with fluorine, where some elements of fluorine were heavier than other elements. And it was Rutherford who suggested these neutrons. It's because one has more neutrons than another, but they're both fluorine. And so to a nuclear physicist, when you describe an element, you say the name of the element, like hydrogen, and then you give its atomic number, atomic weight, 1, 2, or 3, or 4 in this case, depending on how many neutrons it has. And this family of nuclei that all belong to the same element are called isotopes. Same number of protons, just different number of neutrons. So later on, when I'm talking about uranium-238 or uranium-235, uranium has 92 protons. All uranium has 92, but they have different numbers of neutrons. So the number simply refers to how many neutrons you have in there. Okay, so that's an explanation, so I won't have to explain it again later on when I'm going through it, but it will become important. So Fermi, Enrico Fermi, great Italian physicist, one of the greatest Italian physicists, one of the greatest physicists, period, of the 20th century. He's given us more knowledge of nuclear physics than practically any other man. He conducts an experiment right after they discover neutrons. And his experiment is he bombards each and every element of the periodic table with neutrons to see what happens. And what happens is some of the nuclei absorb those neutrons and they become a different isotope of the same thing, right? So if you have hydrogen, basic hydrogen is simply a proton, but some of those hydrogens will absorb a neutron and become deuterium. If they absorb another neutron, then it'll become tritium. And those are the three isotopes of hydrogen. Anyway, he works his way up, and every time he puts in, he inundates an element with neutrons, he creates these isotopes, and for the most part, they're radioactive. They're called radioisotopes. And Fermi would take a foil of the material, let's say, inundate them with neutrons, and literally run down a corridor to another room where he had a Geiger counter, and he would look at the radiation coming out and measure the half-life of the new element. The half-life being the amount of time for half of your sample to decay away. And with each one, he'd record it down, and he was finding all of these brand new elements never been seen before. And everything was going pretty cool until he got to the element uranium, the last natural element on Earth. That's 92, element 92. And then he does the same thing he does, and he runs into the other room, and he gets this plethora of radiation. And it's obvious it's much more than one new isotope, radioisotope going off. He can't explain it. It's just crazy. And he writes it up in the Italian Journal of Physics, his results, and he says, right now it's a quandary. By the way, one of the things I did decide to do was to emphasize the Jewishness of the things going on a little bit. And I believe there was a Jewish woman, a chemist, that came in and tried to explain to Fermi he was probably seeing some stuff, and he was too busy at the time, so she never did make the history books. But anyway, it went in, and there was a chemist, Otto Hahn, one of the world's leading chemists, and he's working at the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute in Berlin. And he reads the paper and he sees Fermi. He reads Fermi's paper and he says, well, I'm going to conduct the same experiment, see what I see. So Otto Hahn, with a Franz Strassmann helping him, they get a thin foil of uranium metal, and they inundate it with neutrons. And sure enough, they get all this radiation. But Hahn is a chemist. And so instead of just simply measuring the radiation coming out, he basically melts the foil in acid, and he separates out all of the atoms, and he discovers the element barium in the foil, and he's perplexed because there was no barium when he started, and barium is halfway up the periodic table. It shouldn't, usually you move 1 or 2 steps on a periodic table. You don't jump 2 or 3 rows, and so he had no idea how to understand this. Now Hahn, who later will win the Nobel Prize for this discovery, but Hahn had a partner, and his partner's name was Lisa Meitner. She was a frail Jewish lady from Vienna, and she was an exquisite theoretical physicist. And Hahn and Meitner together, they were really a potent team. They shared the Leibniz Prize in Germany, which is the highest award in physics in Germany, for discovering technium, a new element of the periodic table back in the 1920s. And so she was very well respected. She was respected as one of the world's great physicists. And in 1933, with Hitler's regime coming in, she was soon forced to start wearing the Star of David, a yellow Star of David on her coat. And she got accosted by some brown shirt thugs trying to get back and forth to work. And it was becoming obvious, it's getting dangerous. And she was a Austrian citizen, right? She's from Vienna. So for a little while, she had some protection being an Austrian rather than a German. But then Hitler, of course, with the Anschluss, puts Austria now becomes part of Germany. And now it's really dangerous for her. And so Hahn and Meitner decide we need to get you out of Germany. And so Lisa gets ready and she leaves. And Hahn gives her a diamond ring that belonged to his mother, just for emergencies, and say, if you need it, this is for emergencies. And Meitner moves off, and she moves to a small village in Sweden called Kungälv, and she's up there, okay? And this is right after the Anschluss, so right around 1938. Then in December 1938 is when Hahn does his experiment, and he discovers this barium, and he has no idea how to interpret it. So he writes Lisa a letter, goes to Sweden, and she gets it. And it's Christmas time, and her nephew from Vienna is visiting, and they're kind of sitting there. And within 4 or 5 days, Meitner reads the letter and interprets it and comes up with a theory of nuclear fission and decides what Otto Hahn had seen was the atomic nucleus split. Okay, this was unheard of. At that time, nuclei were these super strong kernels of the atom that were held together by strong forces, and no one even dreamed you could ever split something like that apart. But Meitner did. So she, in the movie Oppenheimer, there's a trailer, and the producer says the mastermind of the atomic program was Oppenheimer. And in my mind, no, the mastermind behind this was this 90-pound Jewish girl from now Sweden named Lisa Meitner. She was the real person who introduced the world to what we now call the nuclear world. It was this, well, I call her gentle, but if she's anything like my 4'10", 90-pound Irish-born grandmother, she was tough as nuts, tough as steel. So, but anyway, but Lisa Meitner, and I had the privilege of visiting her grave. She's buried in Bramley, England, a small town in England, where I believe she was working with the British atomic physicists later on in life. But anyway, she's the real mastermind behind the atomic age. And I disagree with the Oppenheimer movie on that point. Oppenheimer, you'll see, by the time Oppenheimer gets involved, the problem is gone a long, this issue's gone a long ways. He was not the brains behind it. Okay, and there she is. And that's Fermi. Two great, I guess I'll mention it. Fermi marries Laura. She's Jewish. Her father was a naval captain in the Italian Navy. And when Mussolini takes over, they also see the problem. And when Fermi wins the Nobel Prize for those experiments he was doing, and he's on his way to Stockholm to do it, and they realize the danger to Laura and to the whole family. So they escape. They secretly escape with the family, get him up to Sweden. While he's in Sweden, Fermi visits Meitner. He goes sees Lisa in Kungälv, and the two of them spend a day or two together. And Meitner briefs Fermi on all she's learned and her theory of nuclear fission. And then Fermi the next day gets the Nobel Prize, gets on a ship, and he goes off to New York Harbor, and he accepts a position on the faculty of Columbia University. Okay. So we get the premier physicist in the world practically comes to America because of the anti-Semitic issues that were going on in the fascist government of Italy. Okay. Next. Lisa and her nephew, Otto Frisch, they take the theory and they co-write an article for the British physics journal Nature, and it goes in. Within a couple of months, there are atomic programs in Germany, where fission was discovered, in Great Britain, where they're going, but also in Japan, in America, and in the Soviet Union, all start atomic programs. So the idea that you think, that this was some super secret thing in Oppenheimer's mind, that nobody, that's not true. Even before World War II started, there were atomic bomb programs started in at least 5 countries I know of, including Japan. Okay, and but there was an issue that came up that what I failed to mention before, and I really need to keep my eyes on this thing because if you don't know Liz, she's tough as nails, and if I go over, I've been warned by other people of the congregation that I may not be walking pretty straight after that. So Liz, just give me a warning. But anyway, what was also astounding is that Lisa and her nephew, just on pieces of paper, that's the only evidence they had, right? A letter written by Otto Hahn. They not only come up with this theory that they were witnessing the splitting apart of the nucleus, but they measured the energy, how much energy was released. And you say, well, how could they do that? Well, there's a really remote, unknown physics equation that only the people with the highest physics degrees know. And it goes something like E is equal to mc squared. Okay. And if you take the mass of the uranium nucleus and you take the mass of a neutron, that's the mass before the interaction. And then you take the mass of the fission fragments, when it splits, they're called fission fragments. You take the mass of the 2 fragments, and then there are usually 2 neutrons released, and you add up those masses, and you'll get a difference. You'll find that there's less mass after the event than before. So you take the difference in mass, multiply it by c squared, and that gives you how much energy was released for that interaction. And that's how she did it. And she's a smart cookie, okay? She knows what she's doing. And she discovered that a nuclear fission interaction was 1 million times more energetic than a chemical interaction like dynamite or TNT, 1 million times more energetic. So they also, in that article in the journal Nature, they mentioned, oh, by the way, this thing's 1 million times more energetic. This new form of energy called nuclear energy was 1 million times more energetic than anything we've experienced with chemical reactions. And now that raises a question among nuclear physicists that if this reaction is 1 million times more energetic than chemical reactions, then Otto Hahn should have seen his uranium foil melt or disintegrate. I mean, that's a huge amount of heat, huge amount of energy, all that kind of energy. It should have, but the foil was still the foil. When you held it up, it was still a foil. And that's a mystery. What's going on? Apparently, most of the uranium did not fission, even though there were plenty of neutrons going around, but everything didn't fission. And the question is, why not? And the answer to that comes from a Dane, Nobel laureate named Niels Bohr, called the father of the atom, and an American, John Wheeler, probably one of the greatest American physicists in the 20th century. And none of you know John Wheeler. Well, he coined a phrase called black hole to describe a star so massive that even light can't escape from it. That's John Wheeler came up with that. And you probably all know Richard Feynman. You know, everybody knows Richard. Well, who was Feynman's thesis advisor that helped him get the Nobel Prize? John Wheeler. That was Wheeler. So Wheeler is a big deal in the physics world. And Wheeler meets, there's a picture of him, John meets with Niels Bohr. They go off to Princeton and they tackle that. And then using a law, some work done by Enrico Fermi back in the 1930s. And I won't go into that. I'd love to go into that, but then we go really into physics, and then I really would get kicked out of here. I love talking about physics, but apparently my son warned me nobody else does, so I'll skip that. So anyway, they use this law that Fermi and another gentleman by the name of Paul Dirac, an English Nobel laureate, had come up with. And using their laws, they realized that only uranium-235, the isotope uranium-235, was undergoing the fissions, not the predominant uranium-238. Uranium-238 comprises 99.3% of natural uranium. The other 0.7% is this U-235, and a tiny amount is U-233. And in this paper, they say it's uranium-235 that's fissioning. And in other words, the implication is very clear. And if you want to make an atomic bomb, all you got to do is separate the uranium-235 out of natural uranium, slap it all together into what they call would be called a critical mass, and it'll blow up and it'll give you one big explosion. But that's it. So the design was right there and done. This is 1939, right before World War II. Even then, physicists knew how to make an atomic bomb. It was simply get a critical mass of uranium-235, and you got it. Hold it together long enough, it goes. So leave it the rest. The design, frankly, people knew how to make an atomic bomb before even World War II even started. And so based on that, then the question came up, well, how much uranium-235 would make a critical mass? And that was also two Jewish physicists, they're expatriates, Rudolf Piles and Otto Frisch, Lisa's nephew. They get accepted into Great Britain by a gentleman by the name of Mark Oliphant, who was Rutherford's deputy. Remember, I mentioned Rutherford, the Cavendish Laboratory. So Oliphant is an Australian born in Perth, and he has a astigmatism. He has some handicaps, so you can barely. I think he's legally blind, and when you get pictures of him, he has very thick glasses going on. But he had this phenomenal love of physics and nature, and he was just a brilliant man. And he wins a scholarship to go to the Cavendish Laboratory in England. So he leaves Australia, comes, and he's so successful, he becomes the deputy director of the Cavendish Laboratory. He discovers tritium, the third isotope of hydrogen. So he's a big wheel, and trying to keep everything on tune. By this time, he's the head of the physics department at the University of Birmingham, and he takes in Rudolf Piles and he takes in Otto Frisch, who are escaping from Nazi Germany, and he puts them in. And they set about, Piles and Frisch set about trying to calculate what is the critical mass of uranium-235? How much uranium-235 would it take to make a bomb? And they do their paper and they give it to Oliphant, and Mark looks at it and he brings it up to the British government. And the British government, unlike the American government, the British government goes, oh my, this is not good. And then they start a committee and they start to write a report, how to make an atomic bomb. And it's called the MAUD report, M-A-U-D. It's not an acronym, and I won't go into the origins, but there is a funny story behind it, but I won't tell you it. Read my book. Anyway, and so they get it, and then they share it. They take a secret copy of it and send it to America. So it's Americans. And the guy who gets it in America, he quickly looks at it and he puts it in a safe, and it doesn't go anywhere. So when it arrives in America, it just stays secret. And Oliphant is kind of, what the hell happened? Americans are not reacting. There's no coming back. So Oliphant decides to come to America and figure it out. And he goes to see his really, really good friend, Ernest Orlando Lawrence. Lawrence created the University of California Radiation Lab, or the RAD Lab in Berkeley back in 1931. And in 1937, Oliphant had come out to Berkeley, spent half a year with Lawrence to learn how to put a cyclotron together. This is something that Lawrence would win the Nobel Prize for. He created a machine that could accelerate particles that could penetrate the nucleus of an atom. And Lawrence he wanted to share it with everyone. And he shares it. And that picture in the bottom, Lawrence is on the right, Mark Oliphant is on the left. And they're near a construction site at Berkeley where they're going to be building up a bigger cyclotron. Okay, so how am I doing here? So finally, Lawrence gets Oliphant an appointment to see a man who now today we'd call the president's science advisor. His name is Vannevar Bush. You don't know him either, I know, but later on he creates something called Raytheon Corporation. So he's very well placed, really good guy. He made his millions by inventing a radio that could run off of house electricity rather than batteries. Originally, all radios ran off batteries, and then he invented this thing. Well, just plug it in the wall and it won't go out, and he wins millions of dollars with the invention. Anyway, Vannevar Bush is in Washington, and he has the ear of President Roosevelt, and so excuse me, Lawrence gets Oliphant to see him, and Bush doesn't believe it. He says, I don't think it can be done. And finally, he absorbs. He's an engineer. So what do you want? He's a mechanical. He's the head of the mechanical engineering department at MIT for about 20 years. But anyway, finally, Bush accepts. Oh, to make an atom bomb, the Maude report says you need about 50 pounds of uranium-235, and you'd have the equivalent of about 10,000 tons of TNT if you did that. And so Bush says, oh, to make it, all I need to do is separate out the uranium-235. And that's when Lawrence comes up and says, well, I have invented a machine that can do that. He changed the cyclotron into what he called a Calutron, California University-tron. And he tested it. And at Berkeley, they did that. And so they went off to do that. And okay, so then Bush goes to see President Roosevelt. And Roosevelt then gives him permission to start an atomic program. Okay, now, a lot has been said about, and in the movie, that there's a letter signed by Einstein that goes up to President Roosevelt, and that's when he becomes awakened. Oh my God, I got to do something for the atomic bomb. That's a bit of an exaggeration. There was a letter signed, but it was signed, 3 Jews got him to sign it. It was Leo Szilard, Edward Teller, and Eugen Wigner, 3 Hungarians. And they wrote up this letter and they gave it to Einstein and at his summer home on Long Island, and he signs it and it goes up. But the problem is Roosevelt had already heard about the atomic bomb before the letter got to him, which is not often said when people tell you this myth. Okay, so in fact, where he had learned about it is Enrico Fermi had come, they got him down to Washington, and the Navy was very interested in having a nuclear submarine, using this new energy to propel submarines. And Fermi gave his talk on nuclear reactors that he was building. And so the Navy head of research, the admiral, got a Navy panel together to hear about Fermi. So Fermi arrives and he shows up in the Pentagon at the office of the Navy admiral, and the sailor is sitting there. And I say, he must be from my old neighborhood in Brooklyn, because he looks up at him and he gets up and he opens the door and he goes, hey, Admiral, the WAP is here. And so he puts it down, and then they let Fermi into the office. So Enrico, welcome to America. So, okay, so, all right, so that's that. See, this never made the movie. Aren't you having fun? Aren't you having fun now? None of these things make it. Apparently the producer never came from Brooklyn. All right, so Bush now has to start an atomic program, and he's helped by 2 things. And that's the Calutron, invented by Lawrence to enrich the uranium. Enrich means to separate out uranium-235. But also, back at the RAD lab in Berkeley, one of Lawrence's lieutenants, his name is Edwin McMillan, he also decides, well, if Otto Hahn can do it, I can do it. So he decides to replicate Otto Hahn's experiment, except he has a cyclotron. He has neutrons up the yang-yang, and he's shooting these things into uranium. And he takes it another step. He sees the fission. He sees all this fissioning going on, but he takes it out, and he's also a renowned chemist, and he separates it. And sure enough, Uranium-238 was not fissioning, but it was absorbing the neutrons. So uranium-238 was becoming uranium-239. It was becoming an isotope. And McMillan separates that out, and he notices it's decaying much more rapidly. Natural uranium decays half-life of 500 million years. I mean, it's very stable. That's why so much of it's still on the Earth. But this new one has a half-life of 4.5 days. And you realize this must be uranium-239 decaying into a brand new element. And when it decays, it releases an electron. It's called beta decay. So now you have one more proton. What happens is one of the neutrons becomes a proton and an electron, and it shoots out the electron in beta decay. So element 92 now becomes element 93. It's a brand new element, never seen before by humans. And uranium is named after the planet Uranus. So the next planet out is Neptune. So he calls the brand new element Neptunium. So there's this Neptunium. And he's on his way. Now he's really intrigued with this, and he's exploring this Neptunium. And Lawrence comes into his office and says, Ed, I need you. I need you in Massachusetts, in Cambridge. And to show you how much respect Professor Lawrence gets, McMillan, who will win the Nobel Prize for this work, gets up and goes to Cambridge, Massachusetts. And on his way east, a chemist that works down the hallway from him by the name of Glenn Seaborg, a Swede, sends him a message, Western Union message, saying, hey, Ed, if you don't mind, I'd like to pick up your experiment where you left off. And Ed says, sure, go ahead, Glenn. So Glenn then takes, and Glenn's a first-class chemist. He isolates out Neptunium. He gets a sample of Neptunium, which is tiny. This is like a microgram of stuff. You can't even see it. And he separates it out, and he looks, and he's measuring it, and it too is decaying rather rapidly. Neptunium only lasts for about 7 days, 7 days. And it's also beta decaying. So element 93 must be decaying into element 94. Bam, bam, right? So, and these are minute amounts he's looking at. And so what's the next planet out after Neptune? It's Pluto. And so Seaborg gives the new element the name plutonium. Okay, so Seaborg now discovers plutonium. And like uranium-235, it has similar properties, which I won't go into unless you'd really like a physics lecture at the end of this. But I will not do that. But plutonium has shared properties with uranium-235, and they suspected this sucker probably also fissions. So they shot neutrons at it, and sure enough, it fissioned. And its cross section, which means its probability of fissioning, was much higher than U-235. So it was actually a more potent atomic fuel for its atomic bomb than uranium-235. Then they had to look at the half-life, and its half-life is 24,000 years. So it's extremely stable. So plutonium slowly, so if you make a weapon, it'll stick around for a while. You know, it's not gonna decay away in a year or two. It's going to stay around. So it was a viable alternative fuel than uranium-235, and it all came out of Berkeley. This is coming out of Berkeley now. Los Alamos doesn't exist yet. Okay, so let's see. Okay, so now Bush needs to get this done, and the RAD lab is making these great discoveries, but it's not designed to be a manufacturer. So Vannevar Bush has this atomic program he has to get for the president. They need to make an atomic bomb. And so he goes to the United States Army, he goes to General Marshall, and he explains the situation. And Marshall agrees to take on the mission of creating an atomic bomb. And he gives it to his Corps of Engineers, and they get together. And I'll skip through some of the blah, 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 but they give it to the Corps of Engineers. It first goes to the Schenectady district, and then they move it down to the lower Manhattan district, lower New York district in Manhattan, and they give it the name Manhattan Project. And they start with a Colonel Marshall. He is not energetic enough, and then they get a Colonel Dick Groves to run it. And Groves gets in there, and within 48 hours, he procures in a secluded place along the Clinch River in Tennessee, which has lots of electricity from the Tennessee Valley Authority. And it's called Oak Ridge by the local natives. And boom, they put it there. And that's where they're going to put a factory and fill it up with calutrons that Lawrence had invented. And that's where they're going to enrich the uranium in this secret plant in Tennessee called Oak Ridge. Okay, and the plant is called Y12. Y12 is the map coordinates of the site, Y12. That's why it has that name. And I'm trying to remember, I don't want to miss everything, but I don't want to piss off Liz either. So I better get moving here. All right, in the meantime, Groves needs to get a central laboratory to coordinate all these activities going on. There's another laboratory in Chicago where Fermi is building a critical nuclear pile to help generate plutonium. There's all sorts of things going on. And Groves realizes he needs a central place where they will finally make the final designs on a bomb. And he flies out to Berkeley and he meets with Lawrence. And he says, Professor Lawrence, I need your help. I need you to create another laboratory, a central laboratory. And Lawrence tells him, he says, Dick, I'd love to help you, but I'm up to here at Y12 trying to get Y12 operating. And it was very difficult. Finally, there it is there. Those were all ladies. They got it. They took physicists from Berkeley, got it down to Oak Ridge. They set it up and they got some local guys around and everything was floundering. There was posits and all that. So Lawrence comes, he tears the whole place apart, puts it back. But this time they recruit young women out of high school to run it. And because they made this phenomenal discovery that the women actually read the instructions on how to run things. And so on the second time around, it's not an accident that those are all women. Those women are producing the uranium that will be made, which will make the Hiroshima bomb. And that's why, and there's a book, The Atomic Girls, I think. And that's why they are the Atomic Girls. Those are the young women who are running the Calutrons for Lawrence. So Lawrence is right in the middle of this thing. There's a major crisis going on. And so he'd like to help Groves out, but the last thing he needs is to get now another problem, starting yet another laboratory. So he says, look, let me introduce you to my theoretical physicist in my laboratory. His name is Bob Oppenheimer. And so he introduces them. And so Groves says, okay, I'll go with your recommendation. And that's why Oppenheimer gets involved. And Oppenheimer, as you know, he takes his childhood place out in New Mexico, and they start this laboratory in New Mexico. And it's supposed to coordinate the activities and design the bomb. And that is so well written in the history. Do we have any Los Alamos people here? It's like the Marine Corps. Their PR department is huge. All right. So anyway, that's how that gets started. And Oppenheimer now has to start recruiting renowned physicists. And he relies very heavily on what I would call European-trained theoretical physicists to come over. So he gets Hans Bethe, Vicky Weisskopf, Enrico Fermi is at the top of his list. When he enlists Fermi, Fermi tells him, I'd love to come, but I want you to enlist Edward Teller. Teller and Fermi met back in 1933, back in Italy and Germany. Teller's thesis advisor was Werner Heisenberg of the uncertainty principle. Rudolf Piles was his roommate. Anyway, so yeah, these guys all knew each other. And so Fermi said, look, you need to also invite Teller to come with me. And he does. So Teller gets invited to go too. And with that, let me go on. What time is it? Oh God, it's so early. I am so cool. All right. So right before they take off to go to Los Alamos, Fermi and Teller are off on a walk. They're walking along the Chicago River, I think. And Fermi looks at Edward and he says, I wonder if it's possible that we can use the blast from an atom bomb to start fusion reactions. Now, what he's saying is this, that there are two ways you can kind of get energy out of a nucleus. One is to bust it apart, that's called fission. But another way is you could take two nuclei and fuse them together, and that also releases energy. That is more prominent with small nuclei like hydrogen. You can get them to fuse, and that's factly the energy of the sun. And it was only in the 1920s that they figured out how the sun was creating energy. It was very rather recently that we even figured out how the sun operated, but it was by fusion. And Fermi was saying, well, why don't we use the atom bomb to start up fusion reactions? We'll just copy Mother Nature. We'll just copy the sun. The problem, of course, is that these things only fuse when you have super high kinetic energies to bang them together. And there was a physicist by the name of Ludwig Boltzmann. He's really an ugly dude, but he was very proud of his equation. And if you go to Vienna, to the city cemetery, there is, if you go to his grave, he has his equation written on the front. He's very proud of his thermodynamic equation. And what Boltzmann did was Boltzmann gave us a relationship between heat and energy. So you could say, I need a lot of kinetic energy to bang these things together. Physicists would say, I need high temperatures. Okay. thus the thing when they said cold fusion is a no, 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 no. Cold fusion means no energy, right? Low cold means low temperatures. That means low energies. No, it doesn't work. You need high temperatures, high energies. So, so for that reason, these fusion reactions were called thermonuclear reactions, or high temperature reactions. So another word for a fusion bomb is a thermonuclear bomb. That's where the term comes from. And so Fermi asked Teller, do you think we can make a thermonuclear bomb out of an atom bomb? And Teller says, you know, I think we could. And he calls this new invention the super. And all right, but in the meantime, he goes in. Teller tries to convince Oppenheimer, hey, let's start something. And he argues with him. And Oppenheimer finally allows Teller to create a group at Los Alamos to work and try to create the super. But all the main effort is going to make an atomic bomb. And the two main designs are the gun assembly, where you bang two subcritical masses of uranium together into a supercritical mass, and then it goes. And that will be called the little boy. And then you can't do that with plutonium, because the plutonium is 1,000 times more radioactive than uranium. And so if you tried, it takes 2 milliseconds for this. So as the two plutonium pieces are coming together, they would throw neutrons at each other, and they would start heating up. They would start fissioning before you got a critical mass. And they would fission so much, and you get so much heat, they would expand, and you wouldn't get a critical mass. You'd get a fizzle. You'd just get, boop, you get this excursion of neutrons, but you would not get a big explosion. So it was a problem. And that's where a man named Richard Tolman, who's the head of the physics department at Caltech, came up with a solution. He said, well, let's implode it. We'll make the critical mass by imploding it. Why? Because an implosion is 1,000 times faster than knocking them like together. It takes 2 milliseconds to knock them together. That seems fast, but it's not. An implosion would take microseconds to achieve. And so it offsets the higher radioactivity of plutonium. So there are two models. The uranium bomb would be the little boy, which is basically smashed together. Fat Man is an implosion device in which you now have to implode it together. And it's called Fat Man because you need a lot of high explosive around it to crush it down. All right. So they do it, and they drop the bombs on Japan. Teller is constantly going in to see Oppenheimer, trying to get good people to work with him. Fermi gives 6 lectures at Los Alamos on how to make a super, what the basic principles of the super are. So Fermi's very much behind all of this, but Oppenheimer turns it down. And after they drop the bombs in Japan, he shuts down the thermonuclear research. And out of frustration, Teller quits Los Alamos and he goes up to Chicago, and he joins Fermi up in Chicago, where they create a new institute for nuclear physics up in Chicago. Okay. Meanwhile, Oppenheimer will quit. He leaves. He wants to leave Los Alamos. And as he's going away, he gives a speech, and he tells everyone at Los Alamos it is immoral to be working on this nuclear research. And then he leaves. So he leaves a kind of a sour taste. He's a highly respected individual there. So many of the physicists at Los Alamos take it very seriously, as we'll see. And so then Oppenheimer leaves Los Alamos, and he goes back up to Berkeley, and he rejoins Lawrence, and he rejoins the Rad Lab up in Berkeley. Later, he'll be if offered that position at Princeton, but I think I'll skip that for now. Okay, so meanwhile, back at the ranch, the new director at Los Alamos, a man named Norris Bradbury, he goes to Teller, and he asks Teller to come back to Los Alamos and continue the super research. And Teller does. Teller comes down. He can't get many Los Alamos people to work with him because of the effect that Oppenheimer had, saying this is all immoral work. And so he goes to 2 of his friends, George Gamow, who's Ukrainian, he was born in Odessa, Ukraine. And he has another guy, Stanislav Ulam, a Jewish Polish mathematician, born in the city of Lviv, which is also gained with the Ukrainian war. You know, Lviv is now part of Ukraine. At the time, it was part of Poland. And so they form, and they start working in 1946. Also, Bradbury calls a conference together, says, well, what do we know about the super? And invited are all these physicists. And among them is a British physicist. He's a German expatriate by the name of Klaus Fuchs. And Fuchs comes in, and he's a very bright theoretical physicist. And he gets together with a Hungarian Jewish mathematician, the greatest mathematician of the 20th century, by the name of John von Neumann. Von Neumann is just phenomenal. He wrote a textbook on quantum mechanics in the 1920s. It's still in print. He was just this phenomenal individual. And Klaus Fuchs and von Neumann get together and they share a patent for the hydrogen bomb. They put together and they actually get a patent, and I've seen it. It's pretty cool. They got a diagram and all that kind of stuff, and boom. And so anyway, 3 or 4 years later, it'll turn out Klaus Fuchs is a Soviet spy. And there'll be 30 other people around the old Manhattan Project that turned out to be Soviet spies. And then the same year, Congress creates the Atomic Energy Commission, which puts nuclear research now in the hands of a civilian agency. And they create the Atomic Energy Commission, which is all civilians. There's one military person, he's called the Deputy Commissioner, who's a military officer, and that's the connection with the Pentagon. And they also have a committee called the General Advisory Committee, and these are made up of physicists who understand nuclear physics really well and are there to advise the commissioners on technical issues. And Oppenheimer is made the chairman of the GAC, the General Advisory Committee. So it's a very important position because that GAC is telling the commissioners what they can do and what's possible, what is not possible for nuclear weapons. And in the meantime, back at the ranch, Stanislav Ulam. Ulam, he invents a method of calculations, which we now call the Monte Carlo calculations. And I won't go into it, read my book. But it's phenomenal. And it requires millions of calculations. So normally you'd say, well, this is useless, except von Neumann had come around. Von Neumann, by the way, you probably think computers, you think of Alan Turing in England, right? The Imitation Game, blah, blah. Well, who is Turing's thesis? Who is his advisor? And that was John von Neumann. And so von Neumann and Turing were really good friends. So if you thought Turing was pretty bright, he was, but he was taught by this guy, Johnny. And anyway, von Neumann builds these computers, and the first use they make to these Monte Carlo things is to do thermonuclear calculations for the hydrogen bomb. All right. And so Ulam writes a paper. He does some calculations. This is March of 1950. And he says, well, we've done our calculations. It's months of calculations. And we decided the design is a fizzle. In other words, it won't work. Teller is livid. In fact, I saw a letter that Ulam writes back to von Neumann. He says, oh, well, I saw Edward today. He was extremely angry and I didn't go near him, kind of thing. And but they did meet, and Ulam makes a suggestion on how to correct some stuff. And Teller kind of comes around, and the two of them sit together and they come up with a new design for the super, in which they write another paper, and I'll call it the new super. And this time, one of the guys, John Wheeler, who arrives and is helping Teller, they're friends. Wheeler has a extremely talented assistant by the name of Ken Ford. Ford writes a computer code, puts it in such a calculations that, this actually may work. This will work, the new type of super. And Wheeler then briefs it to the Atomic Energy Commission. And then the Atomic Energy Commission orders Los Alamos to build and test the hydrogen bomb. Despite Oppenheimer's opposition to that, they're going to do that. Now, in an audience like this, there's always a wiseacre here and there. I know you're out there who like to say, I know more than the speaker, and they like to show their knowledge by saying, you're full of crap and that kind of stuff. So I thought, in order to foreclose that, I have a picture of there. That is Ken Ford there with his wonderful wife, Joanne, and me standing next to him. So there, I got it right from the horse's mouth how this stuff happened, okay? Oh, and by the way, I was on my way to the Army-Navy game, and so another good thing that day is Army won. So it was a pretty cool day. And all right, so they do that. And meanwhile, in August 1949, the Russians detonate an atomic bomb, which is an exact duplicate of our Trinity device that we set off back in 1945. And that's because of the spies. Igor Kurgachev is the leader. They do it. And Lawrence had been arguing, Oppenheimer had been arguing, if we don't do it, if we don't go and do this thermonuclear research, then the Russians won't do it. And, in other words, it's the old, well, if we're just good and disarm ourselves, then the other guy will disarm himself too, kind of thing. And Lawrence was having none of that and saying, no, he says the Russians probably have a thermonuclear program already going. And indeed they did. Back in 1946, they created their own thermonuclear program. Igor Tamm was the physicist ahead of it. And they just hired a guy named Andrei Sakharov that was going to go in, who would be the father of the Russian hydrogen bomb. So yeah, the Russians are going full steam ahead. But in 49, they do that. Lawrence goes down to Los Alamos. He meets with Teller. And he says, how can I help? And Ulam, Stanislav Ulam, says, we need more tritium. We need a lot of tritium. And so Lawrence comes back and he gets an idea how to make the tritium by using an accelerator. And he writes to the Pentagon and says, do you have any federal ground out here that I can use to build an accelerator? And they said, yeah, just go to any old World War II military post that we've mothballed, take one of them. And so Lawrence and his assistant, Louis Alvarez, who's also in the movie, but he's the blonde guy, good guy. So he and Louis Alvarez go around and they look at Camp Parks up in Dublin and other places. And then they get to the Naval Air Station in Livermore. And according to Alvarez, the first thing he says is, we come into town and there's a big banner saying, welcome to Livermore, home of Max Baer. That was the big draw, not grapes, not ranchers. It was Max Baer was the big attraction for Livermore at the day. Anyway, they get past that sign and they go to the Naval Air Station. And they have a huge indoor Olympic-sized swimming pool that they use to train Navy pilots in survival. So Lawrence steps in, looks at the swimming pool, goes, Louis, we found a home. So it was a swimming pool that won him over. And Lawrence decides to take over the Naval Air Station in Livermore. And they build the accelerator. And that's a picture of it down there. It's the Mass Test Accelerator. And so they're building that thing in what we now call Building 431 at the lab. So that's the first presence of the Berkeley Rad Lab in Livermore, is this accelerator. How am I doing? Okay. Teller also goes and he's fighting to get another laboratory built to specialize in thermonuclear research, because he's saying Los Alamos is just dragging its heels. And finally, our commissioner, Tom Murray, comes out to Berkeley, meets with Lawrence and says, Lawrence, we need you to start another laboratory. Lawrence agrees that Los Alamos is dragging its heels too much, and he agrees to start yet another laboratory. This will be his third national laboratory he'll be creating. And so he does. So they already got a presence out in Livermore. So he said, okay, we'll just open it up in Livermore. So on the second day of September, 1952, that sign goes up. It's the University of California Radiation Lab. That's the RAD lab, but it's the Livermore site. So Livermore is actually an adjunct onto the main laboratory in Berkeley. Today's language, we would say it's like the associate director. The head of Livermore would be an associate director. Lawrence was still the director out there, contrary to what Livermore now thinks. Lawrence was the first director at Livermore. Okay. And in fact, here's your leadership. Lawrence also, he picked Herb York, who had helped him out at the Y-12 plant during the war. And York was an incredibly smart physicist. And he picks York. He says, Herb, run the operations out there and recruit Teller. We need Teller, if nothing else, for political reasons. And so they do. They recruit Edward in. And that's the leadership of your laboratory, Lawrence, Teller, and York. Okay. And they had an unwritten charter. Do not rob Los Alamos of its physicists. You can't do that. And don't copy Los Alamos designs. Come up with your own designs. All right. So pretty quickly, they decide we're going to go. And Teller had this idea of mixing deuterium with uranium to kind of make a hybrid hydrogen bomb. It was not a good idea, but Teller was kind of running things. They tested it on the Ruth event. They did that just in 53. It was a fizzle. It didn't work very well. 2 weeks later, there was another shot, Ray. Now, Ruth is named after Edward Teller's secretary, Ruth Brockett. Ray is named after Jim Bell's secretary. Jim Bell was the associate director for engineering, and it's a Ray Doofus. So the two secretaries had two shots. Unfortunately, they were both fizzles. Bad start for women's names for nuclear tests. And they were bad. That was not so bad, but the next year, they're going to go out to the Pacific and test a full thermonuclear weapon. And this is now Edward's chance to show off his full knowledge of a thermonuclear weapon, and it also fizzles. It's a horrible thing. Nothing from Livermore worked really well. And so the whole world is calling for Livermore to shut down, that there was a whole waste of time. It was a failure. And the laboratory had gotten a bunch of enemies by the time. Isidore Rabi, who shows up in the movie, he's a pain in the butt. He tries to shut down Berkeley and some others. And unfortunately, right at that time, when Livermore is at its rock bottom worst, it's had 3 tests in a row that were failures. The president gets, or J. Edgar Hoover gets a letter in which accuses Oppenheimer, his wife, his mistress, and his brother were card-carrying communists. He donated and was associated with communist organizations, and worse, he had lied to Army investigators during the war about attempts of the Communist Party to procure atomic secrets from them. And so Eisenhower just issued an executive order that anyone with a clearance, if you find any suspicious activity surrounding, that requires an immediate investigation. And clearly this meant Oppenheimer should be investigated. And Eisenhower ordered, not like the movie says, but Eisenhower then pulled Oppenheimer's clearance based on the evidence that they were seeing. And he ordered Lewis Strauss, the head of the Atomic Energy Commission, to enforce that. So Strauss calls Oppenheimer into his office and tells him, he says, your clearance is gone. He says, you have the right to fight it if you want, but I would suggest just go with it. And Oppenheimer says, I need time to think about it. So that night, now there's a character in the movie. He's introduced as Dick Grove's deputy. It's Lieutenant Colonel Ken Nichols. And he's a beady-eyed guy, right? He has these circular glasses, and he looks like, frankly, he looks like he's from the Gestapo, right? He's the secret policeman out to get Oppenheimer with all this kind of stuff. And the truth is, no, Ken Nichols is a very handsome guy. And he had several advanced degrees in engineering from European universities. He had a PhD in hydraulic engineering from the University of Iowa. He worked with Dick Groves, scouting out a transoceanic canal through Nicaragua. He's a pretty good guy. And now he's the general manager of the Atomic Energy Commission. And Oppenheimer, when he comes out of Strauss's office, the first thing he does is he calls up Ken Nichols, the evil guy in the movie. The first thing is, Ken, help me. What should I do? Which tells you the movie portrays Nichols as some scheming guy trying to get him, but it was not true. In fact, Nichols was very fond. He was good friends with Oppenheimer, and he really felt for him. But he had to tell him, he says, Bob, he says, I'm the general manager. Legally, I can't give you any legal advice, but I recommend you do this, that, just settle it down. He says, but the evidence is there. You lied to Army investigators. That's not very good. And so anyway, Oppenheimer nevertheless goes in, gets a lawyer, and he decides, I'm going to challenge this. And that becomes the hearing. That's a big thing in the movie, okay? In the movie, it has Lawrence shows up, and then he looks at Oppenheimer, and he turns around and leaves. No. Lawrence was going to be an investigator. At the beginning of the hearing, Oppenheimer admits he lied to investigators about attempts of the Communist Party. And they said, why did you lie? He says, because I was an idiot. If they would have stopped it right then and there, they would have pulled his clearance, and that would have been the end of it. But Strauss wanted to prove Oppenheimer was a Soviet spy. And to do that, he was going to use that his opposition to the hydrogen bomb was the evidence. To get that, then he had to get the boys from Berkeley and Livermore to testify, which meant Lawrence, Louis Alvarez, a man named David Griggs, and Edward Teller. Lawrence shows up to give his testimony against Oppenheimer, and he gets accosted by Rabi, that guy in the movie, and blah, blah, blah. And a commissioner comes in, and Lawrence begins to realize that it's not popular. They're making Oppenheimer kind of a iconic victim of McCarthyism. McCarthyism is going on right now. And so these guys are all saying, this is another McCarthyism thing. And so by being a witness against Oppenheimer, that is just telling the truth on how we tried to stop thermonuclear research, could get you in real public trouble because the press made Oppenheimer a public icon, the father of the atomic bomb. And so Lawrence realizes that his about to go testify, topped on top of now the failure of the third nuclear test, in which the third test, called the Kuhn event, was a total failure, that they're going to shut down Livermore. They're going to shut down his laboratory before it even has a chance to start. And his stress levels go so high that at a banquet that night, he comes down with an attack of colitis, goes into the restroom and vomits up blood into the toilet bowl. He calls up his brother, who's a medical doctor, and his brother says, get back to Berkeley. And Lawrence does. He goes back and he gets to do it a deposition. So Lawrence really did testify, unlike the movie. He did testify, but it was a deposition. The next day, Edward Teller arrives, and Edward does give a testimony, and it's filmed and everything, and it's put on newsreel. I even remember the newsreels as a kid. And Edward is made to look like a absolute villain. I've met physicists at the lab who were working in the 1950s, and they said, Tom, the first time I heard the word Livermore was in graduate school, and it was to sign a petition condemning the place. You know, and so the whole physics community of America ostracized people like Edward, and also John Wheeler, who had helped Edward, any of that. It was pretty horrible. So Edward comes down with his own attack of colitis, and he gets hospitalized along with Lawrence. So the leadership of the laboratory is now in the hospital, all right? Not a good sign. And that means that the whole weapons program of the laboratory falls into the hands of now two group leaders, a 32-year-old Johnny Foster and a 28-year-old Harold Brown. Harold is Jewish American from New York City, went to the Bronx School of Science, and he had his PhD from Columbia University at the age of 22. He's a brain. As soon as he got it, he wanted to come out and work for Lawrence at the Rad Lab. Okay, Johnny, another bright guy, he graduated #2 at the McGill University in Canada. His father was the most renowned physicist in the history of Canada. Got two bright guys, and they take over, and they write out a manifesto, I call it, saying we're going to abandon Edward Teller's ideas, and we're going to come up with our own, and they do. And that's pretty gutsy for two young guys. And Johnny's first attempt is he makes a thing called the Clio, which is a revolutionary new atom bomb, which is smaller than anything ever seen. In fact, I have a picture of it there being delivered to Nevada. It's inside a suitcase. So that's a Polish lad. His name is Tommy, Polish last name. I can't pronounce it. And but I got it, and they carried it out, and it worked perfectly. And then Harold Brown, his group, 2 weeks later, they shoot off his shot, and it is the most smallest thermonuclear weapon ever fired, and it worked precisely the way they said it would, and it put Livermore back on the map, and talk of shutting down the laboratory stopped. Okay, so now we're back on a home ground, and so I'm going to really kick off. So what they do is they got, due to Lawrence's legacy, the way he led things, they got these policy analysts out of the Rand Corporation came in. Albert Vollstetter, Bill Kaufman. I'm naming the Jewish ones at first. They're two great, Vollstetter and his wife, by the way, they got medals from Ronald Reagan for their support to the government. Anyway, they came in and they lived here in Livermore. In fact, Herman Kahn was here. You never heard of Herman Kahn. One guy heard, Merlin has heard. Well, do you know Dr. Strangelove? Yeah, well, Dr. Strangelove is based on the character Herman Kahn, same guy, okay? He lived in Livermore and worked with the physicists at the lab, and they designed smaller and smaller weapons. This was the state of the art here. This is the B-17. That is the thing that Slim Pickens rode down at the end of the movie, Dr. Strangelove. That is it. That's a B-36 bomber. The Air Force had to build one bomber to carry one bomb. These things are monstrous, and you couldn't hide these things. And a big debate came on that if the Russians were going to invade Western Europe, which they kept threatening to do, then what would prevent them from going to all the Strategic Air Command air bases and dropping an atomic bomb on each of them, and one surprise attack knock out the entire nuclear stockpile of the United States? And the Rand Corporation did a study and said they could do it. If it's possible, they really could do that. That started huge debates. And then the Navy comes up by under a guy named Ollie Burke, Admiral Ollie Burke, Chief of Naval Operations. He says, well, what if we just launched our stuff from a missile launched from a submerged submarine? You can't sneak attack a submarine if you don't know where it is. And it's a great idea. However, nuclear warheads at the time were big, monstrous things, too big to fit inside a small submarine missile. And so at this conference, Edward's there with Johnny Foster. And so I talked to Johnny, and Johnny agrees. And no, Edward did it. Edward Taylor steps up. He says, Admiral, I'll try to do my best. The Livermore Laboratory can give you your thermonuclear weapon for your missile by 1960, 59. And Admiral Burke goes up, well, really? And he turns to the Los Alamos guy, Carson Mark, and he says, what does Los Alamos say? And Carson Mark gets up, he says, sir, that's never been done before. It would take a lot more than 3 years or 5 years to do it, and that, this, that, and the other thing. So Burke goes, all right. He looks at Teller, he says, you got a deal. And he makes a contract with Livermore to make a warhead that will fit inside this thing. And Mike May, I should have told you, that big B-17, Mike May designed a weapon 1/4 the size and actually performed better. That's how these guys, these young, they're all in their 20s. Mike is an incredible guy. He's born in Marseille, France. His father teaches surgery in Hanoi before the war. The Japanese are coming. The family uses a relative to get to America, and Mike ends up in Walla Walla, Washington. He goes to Walla Walla High School, goes to Walla Walla College, gets his PhD at Berkeley, and he was an Army paratrooper in World War II, training to drop into Japan. And I look at Mike. Now, if you don't know, that's Mike. He's about 5'8". You know, you carry, I was an airborne ranger, you carry big packs, and they're about 100 pounds. I said, Mike, that pack was bigger than you were. He says, yeah, I guess so. I said, if you would have jumped to Japan, you would have died. I said, those atom bombs saved your life. He's like, I guess you're right, kind of thing. He's a marvelous guy, but that's Mike May there, phenomenal physicist. And they designed a warhead for Polaris. There it is. John F. Kennedy is looking at it, and that's it detonating. And Kennedy realizes the importance of this. He sends a letter to the Navy saying, I can't overestimate how important this is to our deterrence against the Soviet Union. Okay, he gets elected. Kennedy meets with Khrushchev in June, 6 months after he's elected. He just got over the Bay of Pigs fiasco. And Khrushchev thought that Kennedy lacked nerve and he could take him. And so they get this meeting in Vienna, and Khrushchev stands over Kennedy and he says, get your troops out of Berlin. We're coming in. And that's just the first step to taking over Germany and then France, taking over Western Europe. Kennedy is not going to submit 2.5 million West Germans, West Berliners to communism. And he doesn't give an inch. He says, no, he's not going to do it. And Kennedy, right then, a few months before this, the first Polaris submarine got launched, the George Washington. And now we had 10 submarines off the coast of the Soviet Union. And so Kennedy knew that Khrushchev knew that if he tried something, now, if Khrushchev came in, Kennedy had a Berlin brigade in Berlin. They're not going to retreat because Kennedy ordered them, stay where you are. And they're so outnumbered that probably, and he went to the Pentagon and they gave him the plans. And if they start getting overrun, they're going to use tactical nuclear weapons on the Russians to protect our army guys who are grossly outnumbered. There are 98 Russian divisions. We had 4. So we're vastly outnumbered. So bam, 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 we were going to use tactical nuclear weapons. Kennedy says, okay. But Khrushchev blinks finally when he realizes Kennedy's not going to budge, steps back, and he builds the Berlin Wall, and that stops the crisis. That's why the Berlin Wall was built, 1961. 6 months later, Kennedy reflects on how close we had come to a thermonuclear war, and he calls his aide and he says, I want to go out and meet those physicists at Livermore who gave me the Polaris. And so he flies out and he comes out to Berkeley. And here are some of the heroes of this talk I've been giving. This is Norris Bradbury, who is the leader of Los Alamos. But this is Johnny Foster, who by that time is the head of the laboratory. This is Edwin McMillan, who discovered plutonium. Glenn Seaborg, who discovered plutonium. The president, Edward Teller, Robert McNamara, and there's Harold Brown. Okay, and they're all facing, you notice they're all facing the smiling president, except for Norris Bradbury, the Los Alamos guy facing away. And it's kind of symbolic that during World War II, Los Alamos got its big heyday stopping World War II. But in the Cold War, the president came to Livermore to congratulating on stopping a nuclear holocaust in our own Cold War. And so it was really fitting. And he even says in front of 75,000 people here, I am forced to confront an uncomfortable truth. The new frontier, his administration may well owe more to Berkeley than it does to Harvard. So as a public admission, you guys helped. So I remember I went up to Mike May. I said, Mike, what was it like meeting President Kennedy? He said, Tom, the president came into the lobby doors of the Rad Lab, big smile on his face, stepped across, shook my hand and thanked me. He said it was the proudest day of my life. And I knew I had to tell that story. I had to tell their stories. And that's becomes that book, From Berkeley to Berlin. And with that, I don't know if I'm over the 45 minutes or not, just a little bit. Okay, and so welcome, I'll turn it over to Liz. Thank you.
Thank you, Tom, for a phenomenal, wonderful presentation. I think we all learned a lot, whether we're physicists or not. And whether or not we've seen the movie, I think this puts a lot of some additional perspective into that story. For those of you who have questions, Adam Coleman back there or myself, you can pass the note cards to us, and then I'm going to invite Dr. Howard Scott to relay some questions from the folks online.
Okay.
Actually, I do, before we get into questions and then people sit and schmooze, Judy Wheeler from Town Center Books is back there with copies of Tom's book, if you would like to buy them. My thanks also to the Contra Costa JCC, to our tech mensch, our volunteers, and to all of you for coming. Questions?
All right. Yeah, thank you, Tom. So one of the listeners online talking about the young women who are working on the Calutrons wrote in a title of a book, wanting to know if this was the book you're referring to. The Untold Story of the Women Who Helped Win World War II.
Right.
So that is the.
She spoke that up. She was invited to the Bankhead Theater about a year or two ago. She gave a lecture on her book. It's called The Atomic Girls.
Yeah. Okay, just clarifying something about Oppenheimer's reasons for wanting to leave Los Alamos was.
He had a significant change of character after they dropped the bombs on Japan, and he was kind of his character. He was very much moved. He just moved. It's like this speedboat, you know, and you point him and boy, he's full blast that way. You point him that way, he's full blast that way. So during the war, he was very aggressive in getting that bomb built. And they had the interim committee. President Truman created the interim committee in trying to get, what are we going to do with this bomb now that we got it? And it was Oppenheimer who was the most forward, saying we have to drop it on a city, on an actual city, and demonstrate that thing. Ironically, Lawrence was suggesting dropping it in Tokyo Bay and just letting them see it. But Oppenheimer argued strenuously to do it anyway. So he was very, very forward that way. And then after the bombs were dropped and he got to see films of the victims, he had this complete 180-degree reversal. And then he was against that. And he decided he needed to get out of Los Alamos. And as I mentioned in his going away speech, he said, it is immoral to work on nuclear weapons. And then he stepped out, went back to Berkeley.
Okay, another question. You mentioned that there were actually 30 spies found at Los Alamos.
Yeah.
Which seems like a large number to.
Oh, I'm sorry, not 30. I think my numbers are not exact, but I recall 3 at Los Alamos. There was Klaus Fuchs. There was an Army sergeant who ran the motor pool. And then I think one of the engineers had some blueprints. So that was at Los Alamos. The third, and of course, the Rosenbergs in New York were helping to transmit the information back to the Soviets. And then there were 30 workers at the metallurgical laboratory in Chicago. They were Canadians. And they passed on, that was in many ways the most damaging, because they passed on the information on how to make a nuclear pile, which is needed to make plutonium. And so that information got passed off to the Soviet, saving them years of research. They didn't have to make the same mistakes the Americans had made.
Okay, when it came to Oppenheimer, well, you explained what happened to Lawrence and Teller as for their testimony.
Okay.
Was there anybody there actually supporting him?
Supporting Oppenheimer.
Yes.
One person on the tribunal, I think they had 3 judges. One, they voted 2-1 to withdraw Oppenheimer's clearance. And then when it went before the commissioners, there were 5 commissioners, 4 agreed with the tribunal to pull his clearance. 1, Henry Smythe, disagreed. So no, there wasn't much support. Ken Nichols did have to go over the results, and he wrote in his final thing that The evidence clearly showed, and Oppenheimer even admitted that he lied to security personnel. He violated all of these security rules and was pretty cavalier in defending atomic secrets of the nation. And so unless you go by a prescription that if you're distinguished enough, the rules don't go with you, then yes, Oppenheimer should lose his clearance. So there was not much support for Lawrence. That mostly came from the press and the outside, associating Lawrence as being yet another McCarthy victim, because the big thing was to associate Oppenheimer as being another McCarthy victim, another victim of McCarthyism, which was not the case. But anyway.
Okay, and then a question about your opinion about another book which has a representation of Oppenheimer at that time, American Prometheus.
Yes, yeah, I read it. It won a Pulitzer Prize, the book that the movie's based on. But they're the guys who wrote it, Kay Bird, I forget the other guy's name. They're journalists, they're not physicists, and there are claims in there, like I think it's suggested in the movie that Oppenheimer predicted black holes. That's not true. That's simply not true. There are many, many other physicists. If you really want to go, who is the real physicist? It would have to be Albert Einstein, because it's a direct result of Einstein's equations that you would get a black hole. So no. So I think Oppenheimer did write some paper on black holes, but many people wrote papers on black holes. It doesn't mean he invented them. But Kay Bird and the other guy, I think they also said he was the mastermind behind it. And as I tried to show you, no, if there's a mastermind, it was Lisa Meitner, in my mind. She's the one who came up with the theory of nuclear fission. That's the mastermind. And she did it in 4 days. I mean, that is so spectacular.
You mean fusion?
No, I mean fission. I knew. You're not one of those wise guys that comes up in the audience and attacks me. Just checking. No, she came up with the theory of nuclear fission. It took her just a week to do it, based on a letter from Otto Hahn. I mean, that was one of the most spectacular achievements, I think. And she gets no credit at all in the movie, for goodness sake.
Okay, that takes care of all the online questions we had.
Right.
Do we have some in-person questions here?
Yeah.
Yes, Roland?
We need to bring the mic. Yeah, because there's still a lot of people online. And so if I can bring the mic to you, then I have some other questions that were written.
You mentioned John Wheeler. That name is known to me for work on general relativity. Is that the same John Wheeler?
Same John Wheeler. He wrote in the 1970s. He wrote a textbook on the cover. There's an apple with an ant walking on the apple, and yeah, he wrote an instant bestseller. Every serious physics student in America bought John Wheeler's textbook on general relativity. That is the same John Wheeler who I was showing you, who frankly lived here in Livermore too.
And
Wheeler
lived almost 100.
Sir?
Lived almost 100, died fairly recently.
No, well, in the 1950s, Wheeler was out here practically every week. In fact, Mike May and Mike had the job of escorting these guys. And when John von Neumann came, Herb York said, "Mike, will you please escort Professor von Neumann?" And so Mike said yes. And so he would escort Johnny von Neumann, the great mathematician, around. And after a couple of weeks, he said, "Professor von Neumann, it would be my honor if you would come to my house and have lunch with us tomorrow." And Mike had just married Mary when he was still at Berkeley, and she was now pregnant. But he arrived 1 week after the laboratory opened. And so von Neumann says, "Yes, sir. Yeah, Michael, that's very kind of you. Yes, I'd love to have lunch with you tomorrow." So that night he goes home and he tells Mary, he says, "Mary, we're going to have a very distinguished guest for lunch tomorrow." And she says, "Oh, who?" "Well, John von Neumann, the great Hungarian mathematician." She says, "Well, what do Hungarians eat?" I don't know. So she says, "Well, because he's Hungarian, we'll have liverwurst sandwiches." And that's what they had. So von Neumann shows up at Mike May's house and he sits down and Mary gives him a liverwurst sandwich. It was hysterical.
All right, we have a few questions. One, I can quickly clarify. Judy Wheeler is selling Tom's book, The movie of Oppenheimer is based on the book American
Prometheus.
Prometheus that Tom mentioned. Can you ask, one question is, what was the rationale? Why was Oppenheimer selected as sort of the head honcho for the Trinity test?
Right. Well, actually, I did mention it in a way. Grove's first choice to start up the laboratory was Lawrence. He wanted Lawrence to do it. Groves had the most respect for Lawrence to do it. And he comes out to Berkeley to get him. That's who he wanted. And it was Lawrence himself said, I can't do it because I'm taking care of Y12. And he says, look, he introduces him to Oppenheimer. He says, why don't you talk to Oppenheimer? He'd be a good, and by the way, earlier, Arthur Compton had overall charge of designing the weapon. And Lawrence was invited to those meetings and he always brought Oppenheimer with him. And he introduced Oppenheimer around. Oppenheimer was relatively unknown. And so Lawrence would get him around to do that. And you just reminded me, Liz, for this 1 second, I'd like to bring up, especially I was thinking about, I had been thinking there's a very strong Jewish angle in life, among other things. There are other angles, but one of the things is the biggest proponents, some of the bigger proponents for the atomic program were Jewish American physicists who had lived under Nazism. So you had Oppenheimer himself had been in Göttingen, Hans Bethe, who's West German, Fermi had experienced fascism. So these guys were very much aware of how bad it would be. Even Einstein realized how bad it would be for Hitler to have an atomic bomb without America having one. And they had no problems jumping in, designing an atomic bomb. However, they seemed to be not so concerned if a socialist government took over a nuclear weapon. Because the biggest opponents to Oppenheimer and the who was opposed to thermonuclear. So the biggest proponents for thermonuclear were also Jewish physicists from Eastern Europe, people who had lived under communism, like von Neumann, von Karman, Edward Teller, Eugen Wigner, Stanislas Ulam. These were all prominent Jewish mathematicians and Jewish physicists who understood what it would be like if Stalin had his hands on a hydrogen bomb by himself. It would be just as disastrous as Hitler having an atomic bomb. They knew how bad that would be, and they became the most avid opponents to Oppenheimer. So it's kind of interesting, and I kind of noted it in my book. So thank you.
This is maybe more looking forward. Were the physicists aware of what nuclear fallout would do to people like at the local Trinity site? There's been some press about that lately. Were they aware of, besides the just explosive power of the bombs, what radiation would do to people?
The single word answer is yes. Of course, they knew full well what was going. They've been conducting at the Rad Lab itself. They were conducting lots of things. Now, some of this was learned in the 1920s and 30s. So originally, in fact, at the Rad Lab, it was Lawrence's brother, the doctor, saying, well, the radiation can be harmful to you. And nah. And as a test, they took a rat and put the rat inside a bulb and they stuck it inside so the cyclotron radiation went through it. And then they pulled out the bulb after that and the rat was dead. And they all said, oh God. And then someone pointed out, well, you sealed the thing, so the rat probably died of suffocation. And then they said, yeah, so radiation must be good. So it was, they did slowly learn that no, radiation. In fact, if you go to the National Museum of History in the Smithsonian in Washington, they're one of the original cyclotrons, and you'll see that there's an eyepiece on it. And as the particles are going around, they radiate out what's called synchrotron radiation. These like X-rays or strong beam based on the angle they make. And you want to get the beam going exactly right. And the way you do it is they had to align that radiation to go right down the middle of that eyepiece, and then you knew it was focused. And so a physicist would actually get there and put his eye right at the end of the eyepiece, and he would tune it until the beam was going right into his eyeball. And then they slowly learned that is not a good job at the Rad Lab. So yes, in the beginning, there was a lot of naivety. Marie Curie, remember, she burned her hands from handling all that pitchblende. So this was frankly lessons learned as they went along. But definitely, in fact, I think it was Fermi. Fermi predicted how far, or if he dropped the blast wave coming, how far it'd go. And Alvarez had he had got the diagnostics that was going to measure the yield of it. And he had already calculated and realized he had to put it 8 miles from the Trinity device, this airplane, with his diagnosis. So they knew it. And they also understood fallout and what the repercussions were that. Yes, they did know that.
All right, I think that about wraps it up. I had a time deadline too, but you are more than welcome to have some nosh, to pick up a book. And thank you again, Tom, for a wonderful.
Let's go to those. Okay. Thank you.
So